time that'll realize there are fewer years to come. And looking back on all the wrong I have done, well, it all makes sense. I'm why you sent your son.
Well, all right. Welcome, everybody, to Scripture Night. I'm recording this from my home office because I didn't have a chance to get to the studio this week. However, we can do a presentation. And this presentation is called Revelation is History. And the intention of this presentation, my good brothers and sisters, is to show you why the full preterist takes the position that the book of Revelation was written prior to 70 AD, and everything that's in Revelation is showing that Jesus' prophecies were completed in the first century at the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD. And we just want you to consider the interpretation. You don't have to agree, but I think it is best if you at least understand the full preterist point of view before you make a final decision. In other words, maybe you can keep this presentation and this full preterist interpretation in your Rolodex, because one day you might change your mind about your position. So we're going to dig into the scriptures and show you the full preterist position, how we take the position that Revelation is history. Well, all right, here we are, guys, in Revelation. And before we get started, just to remind you, we do have a YouTube membership. So if you click join, you pick the tier that you would prefer if you are so moved to support the ministry. And then you click that tier and click join again. In the silver position, it's $2.99 a month. It's essentially you buying us a cup of coffee every month, and you can cancel anytime. And gold and platinum, those tiers have extra content in case you're interested. All right, so let's dig into Revelation chapter 1, verse 1. All right, and you will see, my good brothers and sisters, right out the gate here, it says this: the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him to show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass. I'm going to say those words again, must shortly come to pass. So right there, first verse, the full preterist says, well, he said this has to shortly come to pass. So we take that text to mean shortly after this was written. All right. So right there, I think we have a reasonability to say, well, isn't it possible that if the book of Revelation was written in 65 AD, give or take, that shortly come to pass means very soon, within 5 years, give or take. All right. In Revelation, remember, that's out the gate, right? So I'm just trying to explain why the full preterist takes the position that he or she does. Let's read in the same chapter, Revelation 1, let's read verse 3 and 4. Starting with verse 3, it says, blessed is he that readeth, and they that hear the words of this prophecy, and keep those things which are written, for the time is at hand. See, once again, in verse 3, that's two time statements in a row, both saying that the end of this prophecy is around the corner, that all things in Revelation chapter 1 to 22, we'll discuss that more as we move forward, was to shortly come to pass because the time was at hand. Let's move to verse 4, because that's timeline relevance, right? And we often call that time statements, shortly come to pass, the time is at hand. But we also use a term like audience relevance. So who was this written to, essentially, is what we're talking about. And it is pretty clear, I think, what John says here in verse 4. John, to the 7 churches which are in Asia. Now, in a lot of Christianity, what they've done is allegorized the churches. So like, for example, in the first few hundred years, that was this church. And then, in 600 to 1000, it was this church and, et cetera, et cetera. And now we're in the Laodicean church right now, right? Well, if we look at this text a little more with audience relevance and timeline relevance and really consider who he was writing to, he was writing to the 7 churches in a specific location. And that location is Asia. So it's not Canada. It's not the United States of America. It's not Australia. There were real churches, 7 of them, in Asia at the time. And all 7 churches were getting this book of Revelation. Now, I'm going to challenge you to think about it. If you were one of those 7 churches at the time in Asia and you received the book of Revelation, wouldn't you assume that the prophecies in it were for you? I would suggest that that's exactly what you would think. However, in modern day Christianity, they've moved you to ignore the audience relevance and make you believe that this book of Revelation is for you. But no, it stands more to reason, at least from the full preterist point of view, that it was for the 7 churches that actually existed in Asia. All right? So that's our point of view. So I'm just trying to push the idea that at least we should agree that, oh, okay, that's reasonable. We understand why you full preterist take the viewpoint that you do. Do you see? That's what I'm going for here. So let me say this one more time. I'm not trying to force you to believe this. I'm just trying to show you why the full preterist believes that Jesus already returned and completed the work in the first century. And it's right in Revelation that we see a lot of time statements already. And this is just the first chapter. We'll continue. Still in the first chapter, he says the 7 churches in Asia again, where he says, saying, I am Alpha and Omega, the first and the last, and what thou seest, write in a book and send it to who? Not to people in Canada, right? Not to people in the United States of America, but rather send it unto the 7 churches which are, in present tense, when he wrote this book, in Asia at the time. So these 7 churches are getting a review, and he lists the churches. They're in Asia. So you got the location, and these letters, the book of Revelation in totality, was written to them. And they were each getting a review, as you know. So the full preterist says, this is a book that was delivered to those 7 churches that literally existed in the first century in Asia. We'll continue. In chapter 11 is where, because a lot of people say, well, wait a minute, Shade, the book of Revelation was written in 90 or 95 AD. Well, the full preterist disagrees with that date, and we are not the only ones that disagree with that dating. We believe that the book of Revelation times itself. And how does it do that? Well, there was a temple standing at the time that Revelation was written. All right? So let's read chapter 11. And there was given me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein. So you can see there's a temple of God standing at the time. Now, this is a vision, so we don't get over literal with what's happening, but measuring a temple that doesn't exist wouldn't make any sense. But if you put it in the first century context where there was a temple and they called it the temple of God, we as Christians fully recognize that there is no bricks and mortar building that we would ever call the temple of God anymore, because Jesus himself said, no more will you worship in this mountain, when he was speaking to the woman at the well, in this mountain or in Jerusalem, for the time is coming and now is that you will worship God in spirit and in truth, right? From the heart, because we are the temple of God. So, but in that time frame, the temple of God would have been the temple standing in Jerusalem under the old covenant with ancient Israel. So therefore, if the temple was standing at the time and the altar, and there was those who were worshiping therein, that wouldn't be us today. We don't go to the temple especially a singular temple. We don't go to temples at all to worship God. We worship God in spirit and truth, right? Now, that doesn't mean you can't go to a Sunday building, but we understand that that is not the temple of God. We understand that now. Back then, though, I'm going to say it one more time, the temple of God would have indeed been the Jerusalem temple standing that was destroyed in 70 AD. And in verse 2, it's further affirmed. But the court, which is without the temple, which means outside the temple. Do you see there's a courtyard outside the temple? And he says, leave that out and measure it not. For it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread underfoot 42 months. So this is the great tribulation that we full preterists say was between 66 AD, was a point in 66 AD where the Zealots took over the temple, and then the Roman Empire clamped down and encompassed Jerusalem. And that started in around 66 AD. It's written in Tacitus and the writings of Josephus. And then 70 AD, it was destroyed. So that was the 42 months that the Gentiles, which would have been the Roman Empire, taking over the city and basically destroying the temple, right? And notice it says, and the holy city, right? So back then, they would have recognized that Jerusalem was where the temple of God was, and that was the holy city. But we now know that we are the temple of God, and there's no earthly location, a specific land that God would say, okay, that's my city. No, the entire world is his, right? That's the Christian perspective, particularly today. But back then, there was a specific land, Israel and Jerusalem, and a specific temple. So that was the temple of God and the holy city back then. Now we are the temple, and the entire world belongs to God, all right? So I'm going to say this one more time. We believe that this book then must have been written while the temple was standing, and therefore was written in the same time zone as all the other New Testament epistles. And we would also argue that that makes more sense. We have epistles from Paul, John, James, Jude, etc., right? They were all written like around 40 AD, 50 AD, 60 AD. And all of a sudden, this one is written 30, 40, 50 years later. That doesn't make sense. What makes more sense is that this was written in the same time that John, James, Jude, Paul, etc. were writing the epistles, which was all basically between 40, right, give or take, 40 to about 68 AD. They're all written in that time frame. So we believe so was the book of Revelation, and this certainly helps us affirm that. Now, moving forward to Revelation chapter 17, there's a sea beast in Revelation, right? Well, this sea beast has 7 heads, but then the scriptures tell you that the 7 heads are 7 kings. So when we go to Revelation 17:10, so they're human kings. Remember that Revelation is a very symbolic book, but it tells you oftentimes what the symbols represent. So these 7 heads on this sea beast were 7 kings, right? And notice what John writes here. He says, and there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen. So 5 of the kings had already passed away. They'd already died, my good brothers and sisters. Therefore, you're already on the 6th king. So I do have a Revelation series. It's long. I did it about, I think, a year and a half or 2 ago. I'm not saying every interpretation is perfect, but it will help you at least start to see the full preterist point of view. So for example, I take the position that the 5 that are fallen were the 5 Caesars, and that the one that is at the time that John writes the book was Caesar Nero. Other people think the beast in full preterism is Israel, and it was about 7 generals. And that's a good interpretation too, all right? But either way, we're looking at it historically and seeing things that fit. Point, though, ultimately here is to prove that Revelation is history. Well, there's only one more king after the one that's already in place. So how can one king that already is and then one more king last 2,000 years? That doesn't make any sense. What makes more sense is that it's got to be in a fairly contained time frame. So we take the position, since 5 are already passed away and one already is, right? And then he says, and the other is not yet come, but when he cometh, he must continue a short space. So again, we take that short space, meaning he's not going to last very long. All right. So therefore, how can a king that's already in place back when this was written, and then only one more king, last for 2,000 years and counting, by the way? Do you see that? So there's no temple today, therefore Revelation can't be at play today anyways, number one. Number two, the idea that the one king and then one more could last up until now doesn't make very much sense. Whereas if you put it in the first century, the temple was already standing, it was already there, and therefore it was written prior to 70 AD, and therefore this is all about, Revelation is history because it's all about the destruction of Israel, Jerusalem, and the temple. So now, we're going to go to the last chapter of Revelation because this is the other thing, that Revelation starts with those time statements, right? Must shortly come to pass. The time is at hand, right? But so does the end of Revelation. It says it again, repeatedly, all right? So that's why the full preterist, unlike the partial preterist, right? Because there is a partial preterist, you might want to consider that position, and there's the little seasoned saints, you might want to consider their positions. I don't like to hide positions. I think Christians should hear all the positions and then decide for themselves what they think is most appropriate, but never taking you away from the law of loving others as self. I think we should really always be focused on that. That said, for the sake of studying eschatology, the full preterist says, well, if the Revelation chapter 1 says the time is at hand and Revelation 22 says the time is at hand, we take the position that, well, those are bookends. So the entire book from front to back had to have been completed in a short time span, okay, from when it was written, right? So let's read verse 6 in chapter 22. It says, and he said unto me, these sayings are faithful and true. And the Lord God of the holy prophets sent his angel to show unto his servants the things which must shortly be done. Just like chapter 1, verse 1. The things that must shortly come to pass. The things which must shortly be done. So we take that as a time statement that when this was written, and of course we believe it was written in around 60 to 65 AD, that means that it had to happen in a short amount of time from when it was written. And then when we know historically that the temple was destroyed and Israel, Jerusalem, and the temple was destroyed, we take this to be historical records of a prophecy that was made, just like Jesus made his prophecies in and around 30 AD. This prophecy is being made in around 60 to 65 AD, and it all comes to pass in a short time frame, a reasonable time frame. And then he says it again in verse 7 that he comes quickly. So what the futurist position is often is that, well, that don't take that literal, right? But we take the position, well, no, I think in the totality of the scripture, we take this a little more literal. Not quickly in the sense of 5 minutes, 10 minutes. It could be 5 years or 10 years. But we don't think he's talking about 2,000 years. And this is why we draw that conclusion, all right? We're going to continue in Revelation 22. And again, this is not only the last chapter of the book of Revelation, but it's the last chapter of our Bible. Very important, I think, to note that. And verse 10 says this, and he saith unto me, seal not the sayings of the prophecy of this book. Why? Because the time is at hand. So, this is where John is being told, don't seal this, open it up. Because it's around the corner. And again, if you read that in the first century, you would think, okay, well then this is for us, right? So should we be thinking that this is for us 2,000 years later? I don't think so. I think if you were alive back then and you would have read this, that this book is being opened up and you were one of the 7 churches in Asia in the first century, you would say, okay, this is going down in a relatively short amount of time. You would have expected it in your lifetime, all right? So the other position that oftentimes full preterists will mention is we say this, right? In Daniel 12:9, Daniel is told, go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed. See that? The words, in other words, the prophecy he was given back then, Daniel was given a prophecy back then, the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. So as you can see, the words are sealed. So Daniel is basically, most scholars agree that this is a 490-year prophecy. So basically, he's being told, listen, Daniel, This prophecy that I gave you is not going to all come to pass for 490 years. Therefore, no sense in releasing this all out everywhere because it's not until the time of the end. And I'm going to suggest the time of the end is the end of the Mosaic age, the age of the Old Covenant Israel age. So he's told, seal the book up, close it up, because it's not until the time of the end. It's not for another 490 years. That's a long time from now. So just go thy way, Daniel, and seal it up. But John, right? Fast forward to the time of John, and he says, seal not the sayings. Open it up, because now the time is at hand. See the difference? So Daniel's told to seal the book, and John is told to open the book. Daniel is told to seal it because it's going to be for like 490 years. Well, if 490 years you're being told to seal the book, why would John be told to open it if we're waiting for 2000? That doesn't make any sense. So the full preterist takes the position and says, well, if Daniel was told to seal it for the 490-year prophecy and John is told to open it, it must mean that that prophecy, the book of Revelation prophecy, that time was at hand in a reasonable amount of time, not 2,000 years and counting. All right? Now, let's take a good look at verse 11. Because then it says, he that is unjust, let him be unjust still. And he which is filthy, let him be filthy still. Now, folks, this is not what Christians say today, right? We're not going to say, oh, they're unjust. Don't worry about it. Who cares? Those people are filthy. Don't worry about it. Let them be filthy. It doesn't really matter. We don't take that position. Why not? Well, because we want to move people towards loving others as self. We want to bear one another's burdens. We want to be hopeful. We want to be faithful. We want to be good to all people, right? That type of thing. And so if somebody's in trouble and being unjust, we're supposed to expose that darkness, say, hey, this is the wrong way to go. This is not appropriate. You shouldn't be doing that, or you shouldn't be saying that, right? Why is it say, oh, well, if they're unjust, just let them be unjust? If you put it in the first century context and you're approaching the time of the end of the old Mosaic age, right? There's a point where basically it's like, you know what? All decisions have been made. These folks have decided that they're not going to walk the ways of the Christ, the anointed one, the ways of God. They're not going to walk in love and peace and mercy and grace. So they're going to go ahead and be filthy, and they're going to go ahead and be unjust. You know what? We're at the time of the end. They've made their decision, and they will receive the recompense according to that choice. And that's why over here it says, but he that is righteous, let him be righteous still. And he that is holy, let him be holy still. In other words, the end is around the corner. The folks who have decided to continue to be violent, devour widows' houses, use swords to negotiate, and use bribes and things of this nature, they've made their decision. And so just let them be. And if you're the righteous ones and you're holy and you're walking in the ways of mercy, kindness, and peace, go ahead, escape to the mountains and continue to be righteous, because we're at the time of the end. See, then it makes sense. It doesn't make sense to say we're in Revelation and then still tell people, oh, well, we don't want you to be unjust, right? So it goes against what's being said here. But if you put it in the timeline context, then you understand why John has been told to write, if they're unjust, let them be unjust still, because it's time of the recompense. And if you're holy and righteous, then continue to do so. Do you see? And then another time statement, behold, I come quickly. And notice he says his reward is with him. And that's where the recompense, the judgment, came upon ancient Israel. So again, behold, I come quickly. The full preterist says, well, but those three verses really speak to the idea that the time was at hand and the recompense was around the corner. So those who are unjust, let them be unjust. And those of you who are righteous and following the ways of Christ, keep following, because he's coming quickly. And then this is, I believe, the second last verse of Revelation and the second last verse of our Bible. And what does Revelation 22:20 say? He which testifies these things saith, surely I come quickly. Another time statement that says Jesus is coming quickly. So my good brothers and sisters, it's for these reasons that full preterists take the position that Jesus completed the work and delivered the kingdom to God in the first century. Well, all right, guys, that's the presentation. So hopefully, if I've done my job here, I've at least showed you why we as full preterists take the position that we do. And what I'm hoping is that you will not see this position as heretical, that even though you might disagree, you can still see us as brothers and sisters. And hopefully you can love us as yourself. And that's what I'm going for. And I hope that you stay tuned, because I do hope, Lord willing, that I'll get into the studio this coming week, and we're going to do 2 presentations covering Luke chapter 21, which I think is going to further affirm, my good brothers and sisters, that what Jesus said in 30 AD came to pass by 70 AD. And we certainly do have great hope in God and in his anointed one, the Christ. Thanks for listening. And remember, do all things with grace and peace.
You're the head of everything. You're the king that's always been. You're the dove that washes away all my